Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. That is Ryan Roberts. I'm Brian Driscoll. Let's rock and roll. We are talking Notre Dame and North Carolina. Ryan, yesterday we kind of dove into the Tar Heels, kind of broke down who they are, spent a lot of time on the offense because that's the side to be most concerned about. Today we're going to go a different angle. Tomorrow we're going to give our keys to the game, and then Friday we're going to make our predictions. But today we're going to look at this matchup specifically between Notre Dame and North Carolina. So yesterday was an intro to just the opponent. Today is how do these two teams stack up against each other? And it really is interesting. You know, we talked yesterday and we kind of joked that if you could take the best part of Notre Dame, it's defense, the best part of North Carolina, it's offense, make them one team that's a really good team. The problem is the other side of the ball for both teams has struggled mightily. And I'm not sure which one is worse, Notre Dame's offense or North Carolina's defense. I tend to lean towards North Carolina's defense because of the quality of the competition. However, this is what makes this matchup really intriguing, Ryan. Before we dive into specifics of the run game and the pass game and the situational football, I think the intriguing part of this is you've got the good on good and the bad on bad matchup in this game. And which good on good side wins that battle, which of the bad on bad sides wins that battle. That's what makes this a really intriguing matchup, Ryan, just from a big picture standpoint.
I mean, it's something has to give at some point, right, Brian? Like good and bad, right? It's like UNC's offense versus Notre Dame's defense, good on good. One of them has to give at some point, right? Same way on the other side. One bad offense right now for Notre Dame, one bad defense for North Carolina. Who is going to capitalize on that, right? So it literally is just like a breaking point, I think, between both these teams because they're polar opposites in a lot of ways, right? And it just how happens that the matchups are good versus good and bad versus bad, and eventually one has to come out on top, right? So I'm really interested to see just what is the breaking point between these teams because they are just such different football teams, like polar opposites, really.
Mm-hmm. So, Ryan, when you kind of look at the matchup, it's really similar to what we have seen in past matchups, right? Going into last year's matchup, Notre Dame had been struggling for much of the season on offense. Mm-hmm. We started to see a little bit of a wake-up call a little bit for Notre Dame in that matchup, kind of in that USC game, which was the week before for Notre Dame. But up until that point in time, well, I guess I should say, the last couple drives of the Virginia Tech game, we saw the offense wake up. And they did okay against USC, kind of started to show a little bit of life. And when we talk about how well the offense played down the stretch, a lot of it had to do with it started against North Carolina. And it was kind of the wake-up call for the Notre Dame offense in that game. Went for 526 yards, which was the highest mark of the regular season for Notre Dame. The 7.7 yards per play was also the second highest of the season. The only higher was against Georgia Tech later in the year. But coming into that game, Notre Dame's highest yards per play was 6.2 in the opener, 6.0 against Toledo. They hadn't been above 5.8 in between then, and they were coming off of a game against USC where they were at 5.4. So Notre Dame's offense was able to get right a little bit last year. And for North Carolina, it's a similar story. Really potent offense, really porous defense. And again, it was the same story last year. They were coming off of a game prior to playing Notre Dame. They had a bye week, just like they did this week. They had a bye week, and they were coming off of a win over Miami that they won 45-42, in which their defense gave up a lot of points and a lot of yards. And they weren't as bad as they are this year, but they were bad, at least coming into that game. They got worse down the stretch in 2021. But this year you look at it, Ryan, and despite not playing great competition, they've struggled. So it's similar story. Can the Notre Dame offense score enough against a struggling North Carolina defense to win the game? And then can Notre Dame's offense make enough stops? The interesting thing about the matchup the last 2 years, Ryan, is Notre Dame had a harder time stopping last year's North Carolina offense, which wasn't as good as the offense the year before that they shut down pretty well after the first two drives. So It is kind of fascinating. The road game down in Chapel Hill against what I felt was a much better offense with Javonte Williams and Michael Carter and De'Ami Brown and all those guys, Daz Newsome in the slot, that was a much better offense than what we saw last year. But last year's offense was better, and a big part of it was Sam Howell was more of a threat with his legs last year than he was the year before. So this year we don't know what we're going to get because I don't think we know truly what Carolina is. Because of the quality of the competition and because of their defense, they are learning a new defense. It's going to get better. I have full faith and confidence that Gene Chizik's going to get it better. It's how much better and how quickly, which is kind of the same storyline with what we're seeing from the Notre Dame offense. So this is really a fascinating matchup, and we're starting to get into the point of the season, Ryan, where you really who teams are starts to show more and more and more, and that's what makes this a really interesting matchup.
It's really intriguing, Brian, because I mean, right now, if North Carolina maintained this offensive firepower, because someone on the board, I don't know if you saw this, asked if they were similar to Ohio State, and my immediate reaction is like, no, they're not quite at that level, right? But
Right.
this could be a big litmus test as far as how good are they? Are they one of the top 5 to 10 offenses in all of college football? Can they maintain this against the better teams on their schedule? This will be a big indicator of just how good Drake May, this passing attack, and the young running backs are in this football game. Like, we'll get a really good understanding come out of this football game of just how good this offense could be for North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And on the flip side, Brian, like, can this defense really be that bad? Could it really be this bad? Because, like, on paper, it is horrible. And the fact that they haven't played a great team yet gives you, like, a big pause. And I agree with you. I think Gene Chizik's going to improve the unit because he's here for a reason, right? Like, he's been a successful coach for a reason. Like, he knows the game. But right now, man, it's like, I'm just very curious to see both if the offense is as good as those numbers indicate or can be as good as those numbers indicate, and if the defense is really that bad. This is a big, big test for them to show me exactly what North Carolina is, because I don't 100% have a full understanding of them. Like, I know what they have on film right now, but there's a little bit of a curve that you throw in there because they haven't played the best of teams up to this point.
I think two things. I don't think the offense is quite as good as it shows statistically, but it's very good and very dangerous.
Yes.
I mean, that's always true early in the year. You know, when you have that one game that kind of puffs your stats out a little bit, you know, when you play 3 games, you have one off game or one really good game. It can really puff your stats up a bit. I mean, they've scored 63 points against App State. They didn't get all 63 of those on offense. You know, but they scored 56 against an FCS team, but they moved the ball at will against Appalachian State, who's, as we've seen in other games, seems to have a pretty good defense. Not great, but pretty good defense this year. You know, but it is very good. And no, I don't think their defense is as bad as it's shown to me. I think part of it is they've been on the field a lot, obviously, because of how explosive their offense has been. And, you know, I mean, you look at the total plays that they've been on the field so far this year. I mean, they've been on the offense has been on the field or defense has been on the field for 223 plays. That's an average of over 70 per game. And so, I mean, and it's that low because of the A&M game, Florida A&M game, the FAMU game, because they were on the field for 79 plays against Appalachian State and for 78 plays against Georgia State. So part of that is they got to make more stops, but then also their offense has been so explosive. You almost kind of wonder if playing a better offense or playing a better defense might actually help the Carolina defense. You know what I mean? Like if they're playing a team that is maybe making some stops or making Carolina work for yards, does that help them, you know, kind of have more time to adjust? Because that's part of there's the thought is like, well, when a team goes fast, the defense is on the field a lot. That's part of it. The other part of it is when a team scores fast, you don't have a lot of time in between drives to make adjustments, to get coaching done, to get communication with your staff, and then get that communication relayed to your players, and then make those adjustments. I mean, there's a lot of communication that goes on between series. Hey, what are you seeing? What they do here? And then you got to relay that up to the booth, or if the coordinator's down in the field, whatever the case may be. And when your offense is just really fast tempo and scoring quickly, which North Carolina does a little bit of both. They're not a blazing fast. They're not, you know, Oregon 2011 type of tempo, but they move with tempo. Mm-hmm. And when you're scoring with the big plays that they're hitting, you don't have a lot of time. So it's almost kind of like if you're Gene Chizik, like, man, I hope the Notre Dame defense comes to play today for just a few series. Like we still want to score, but maybe make us work a little bit for those scores so that way we can have more time. And just like I don't think the Notre Dame offense is as bad as it's been so far this year. I mean, I think both units are going to be better than what we have seen. It's just, will this be the week that it happens for one or both of them? And it's kind of hard to think of it both happening at the same time. I don't know how that makes a lot of sense. But I think that's the question is North Carolina will get better. How much better remains to be seen. If you're Notre Dame, you just hope that this isn't the week. And if you're North Carolina, you hope this isn't the week that Notre Dame's offense has a breakout. I mean, there's just something, like you said, Ryan, at the very beginning, something's got to give, right?
Yes.
Something's got to give. And I just don't know what that's going to be,
It is a little unsettling when you think about it like this, though, Brian. Like, even if Notre Dame has a nice breakout offensively, if North Carolina is nearly as good as what they've been on offense, I'm not even saying like to that point. Like, I'm not like they're not going to score 57 points on Notre Dame, right? But if they are nearly that good, I don't want Notre Dame to get into the point where like you have to win in a shootout, right? Like that's not your style. You know what I mean? Like that's why I'm cautious in seeing just how good this offense is for North Carolina, because if Notre Dame can bring them down a couple pegs, right, and you can kind of play to more your style than their style, then Notre Dame is going to be in this game and have a competitive football game. But I just that's why I'm more that's why I'm more curious about what North Carolina's offense is compared to their defense, because I do not want Notre Dame to get into that match where like, hey, we're trying to match score for score because our offense is having a good day and where our defense just isn't playing up to snuff, right? Like, I think the big thing for Notre Dame is like you want to play your style of football, right? Like you want to dictate the pace of this game or at least the momentum of this game. You can't get into that shootout match where that's going to play into North Carolina's favor, and that is not the way to go, in my opinion.
For me, it's kind of when you're Notre Dame, and we'll get into a little bit more of this tomorrow. When you're Notre Dame, you've got to be careful that you're not playing us, and this hurt them against Ohio State. You can't get too far into the keep away game, and I've already seen people say, "You got to run the ball and keep it away from North Carolina." I've said this a million times. All that does is turn a 44-41 loss into a 27-24 loss. You're still going to lose if you're not playing your game. You still got to play your game. You still have to find ways to generate big play opportunities. You're not going to beat North Carolina playing the way you did against Cal. And I even mean not even the way that they played as far as the missed execution. I'm simply saying that game plan doesn't work against North Carolina if you're going to win unless your defense is just brilliant, like it was in 2020. Last year's game was a little bit different, Ryan. Simply because, Notre Dame always, they pretty much led the entire game. They were in control for most of the entire game. And really it was just some big plays from North Carolina that kept allowing them to hang around. But there were multiple times. I think North Carolina took like one lead. I think it was like third quarter. They quickly took a lead in the third quarter. The Notre Dame got it right back literally less than a minute later. And then every time Notre Dame, you felt like they were going to kind of pull away. They went up 31-20, Carolina answered back. They went up 41-27, Carolina answered back. And, you don't want to be in that situation where, because you don't have Jack Cohn to rescue you like you did last year when the defense was giving stuff up. So like you said, you don't want to be in a situation where now it's on the road where, you miss opportunities to put a team away that you should put away. But you have to be careful that you don't get so much into the keep away that you lose any chance of rhythm you have on offense. Mm-hmm. And that's the interesting aspect of this matchup. But speaking of the matchup, Ryan, how about we dive into the matchup now? Let's kind of get to it. And a lot of the stuff we can continue as we're diving into that. But when, kind of what we're doing here today is we're going to take a matchup. We're going to discuss how Notre Dame's rush offense, pass offense, scoring offense matches up against the Carolina areas of their defense, and then we'll flip sides Notre Dame's defense against the Carolina offense, and just kind of talk about who holds the advantage based on paper, try to get some context of the numbers, and then also discuss some areas, Ryan, of the personnel matchups within these statistical matchups that are going to be important to the game. And so we're going to begin with the Notre Dame rushing offense against the North Carolina rush defense. And I think this is You talk about the good on good matchups or the bad on bad matchups. This is the biggest bad on bad matchup that we're going to find, in my opinion. I think a case could be made that the Notre Dame pass offense is worse than the rush offense, and I would agree with that. But I think the North Carolina pass defense is a little bit better than its rush defense. I could be wrong on that, but that's kind of how I perceive it. But they're neither of them that good. Notre Dame had a bit of a breakout on Saturday, Ryan, and it shows how bad you were that 147 yards is considered a breakout for a team like Notre Dame. That's what they did against Cal this past weekend. But Notre Dame, as you can see, ranks in the bottom 30 in the country in yards per game and yards per attempt, as does the North Carolina defense. Notre Dame ranks slightly higher in the disruptives. Notre Dame has been better at disrupting. They haven't allowed a lot of disruptives, which this part down here, Ryan, this number down here is actually kind of troubling if you're Notre Dame.
Yes.
Because you're in a situation where it's like you're not rushing the ball. Okay, well, you're giving up a lot of negatives, or you've had a lot of tackles. Well, they're not really giving up a lot of those. They had, Ohio State had some, but they're doing a pretty decent job of limiting negatives. The problem is they're just not getting any push. And even on Saturday against Cal, we saw a much better performance, but it wasn't like they were opening up these gaping holes. So I'm very curious how this matchup's going to be, Ryan, but this is, I mean, it's kind of hard for me to pick one. I gave the advantage here. I didn't give either one an advantage. So I'm going to have an article coming out later breaking these numbers down, and I went even on this one because they're both bad. And yes. I think if you were going to give Notre Dame an advantage, it would be because Notre Dame's production has come against better teams than you could argue than North Carolina's rush defense. They've given up 56 yards to Florida A&M, which is a pretty good performance, but then 288 to App State and 235 to Georgia State. Notre Dame obviously struggled to run the football against Ohio State, only had 176 yards or 76 yards. I wish the 176 yards. That would have been a different outcome if they had rushed 176 yards. Ran for only 130 against Marshall and 147 against Cal. Notre Dame's best yards per carry average on the season is 3.6 this past weekend. So definitely, Ryan, two struggling units coming into this game.
This one's the biggest indicator for me, Brian, if I'm being completely honest. Like, this is where I'll have a good, I think, understanding of how this game kind of, like, if I had to look at a box score after the game and I just kind of had everything else blocked out and I saw what Notre Dame's rush offense was able to do against North Carolina's rush defense, I think that's a big indicator in this game, because one thing I think you saw last week, there was more of an emphasis on running the football by design, by necessity, a little bit of everything. But I think that whether it's going to be nearly to that degree or it's just going to be kind of a kick up as far as the dependency of running the football, I think that you're going to see an emphasis on establishing it, because that's how Notre Dame needs to win right now, right? Like, we've talked about the passing offense and kind of there's maybe a little bit of a ceiling on it right now, just with some wide receiver injuries and inconsistencies and quarterback play and everything kind of put together, right? So I think running the football is going to be very important for Notre Dame. And North Carolina has showed over the last couple games that they're not very good at stopping the run, right? So I think that it's not even a keep away thing for me, right? Because, again, I know you already talked about that a little bit. I don't want Notre Dame to just be, we have to run the ball every play and we're just going to keep them off the field. Like, that's not the recipe for success. But I think a recipe for success is to dominate in the trenches and to dominate as a rushing team. So with that in mind, you have to be able to take what has not been a strength of yours, make it close to a strength, and then dominate what's been an extreme weakness for the team that you're playing, right? So I think this is a big indicator of this football game. Notre Dame has to dominate this particular matchup, because you cannot go against this bad of a rush defense and come out and say, wow, we didn't really have a good game rushing the football. That is a big siren off. As if the first 3 games rushing the football hasn't been like kind of a alert, kind of for the fan base and just an analyst base. If they're not able to run the football against North Carolina, that is not a
big red flag.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a big red flag, Ryan. And, you talk about turning what's been a weakness into a strength. I mean, everything on offense so far this year has been a weakness. The thing that I would say is, and we would both agree on this, the running game was expected to be a strength of this football team. They came into the season thinking it was going to be a strength of this football team. And last week you started to show it a little bit. Now you have to do it. But I'm gonna say this, however, is there's more there. We'll get to we'll get to the pass game here in a minute and how that's going to impact the run game. I think for me, when it comes to the run game, it's about establishing an attitude in this game. I think that even last week we saw the line play better, but I think if this offense is going to get turned around, especially with the change of quarterback, that they have to come out, and the offensive line has to start asserting its will even to an even greater degree than it did a week ago. I think that's very, very important. I think that the North Carolina front is not as big, in my opinion, as what Cal had. But the thing that I'll say, Ryan, is I think there's more actual talent there. And that's the interesting and intriguing thing about this matchup, if you're looking at it for North Carolina, is North Carolina has some dudes on defense in their front seven that you look and say, boy, if Miles Murphy jumped in the portal this offseason and he has grades, sign me up. You know what I mean? Like, I'll take him. If Noah Taylor has a 6th year of eligibility and Isaiah Foskey's in the pros and you're looking for another Viper to fill Foskey's shoes, sign me up. You know, I'll let him come in and provide some depth. There's some guys on this. Desmond Evans is a young but very talented player. So another guy that I would say, yeah, I'll take that guy to provide some depth. Now, not all of them would come to Notre Dame and start. I'm not saying that, but they're good players who would be part of the rotation. Miles Murphy would start next year when Jason Ademilola leaves, in my opinion.
Yeah,
but it's not that they have a bunch of bad players. They have more athletic talent than what Cal had. They're just not as good of football players as what Cal had, and they're not coached as well yet as what Cal is, where Justin Wilcox and Peter Sherman have kind of built that thing over the course of years. Gene Chiswick is kind of starting over from scratch with this group. Yep. I mean, he's having to do with the defense what Chancey Stuckey and Harry Heastand are having to do, but even worse, because the North Carolina defense was even worse than what the Notre Dame receivers and offensive line were, as we saw when they played each other last year. You know, they made the Notre Dame offensive line look pretty good. You know, and then just their inability, they couldn't tackle. I mean, they had a play that should have been a -4 tackle for loss, pinning Notre Dame around their 5-yard line, turns into a 91-yard touchdown run, right? That's how bad their defense was last year. I don't think they're that bad now, even though the statistics aren't pretty. But this is still a game that if you're Notre Dame, you have to assert your will. And it's not about ball control. To your point, Ryan, and I'm glad you said this, people said I thought Miles Murphy was at Clemson. There's 2 of them. One is a defensive end from Clemson. The other is a defensive tackle. Too. Yeah, same recruiting class. The other one is a defensive tackle for North Carolina. That the Miles Murphy from North Carolina was a borderline top 100 guy. It's still a different player, but he was still a good prospect nonetheless. He was still a top 150 caliber prospect in my opinion. Borderline top 100 guy in my view. Good football player. So yes, different players. I know it can be confusing. But when I look at the matchup, Ryan, I don't want them to establish the run because they're trying to play keep away from North Carolina. That's what I hate. If you're going to come out and dominate with the run game, it's because that's the identity you're trying to establish with your football team. And I just don't feel when you try to play keep away, you can win games that way. Yes, Notre Dame kept Ohio State's points down, but you know what? They lost. They lost by 11, right? You still have to score. And I'd rather win in a shootout than lose in a game like 21-10 against Ohio State, right? And so there does have to be that. So I don't want to be a ball control thing. We'll get into some of the keys next tomorrow, but I want to see them still spreading Carolina out. I still want to see them maintain that same philosophy that they had this past week of get your movement, get on the perimeter, do the things to make North Carolina do this, because it's even more pertinent now because last week, getting the eye discipline off, getting guys moving and thinking and spreading them out and creating those lanes allowed you to go for 5 yards, 6 yards, 9 yards, and really lean on Carolina against Cal. Against Carolina, those things turn into 50-yard gains because they're more prone to the bigger mistakes where you were trying to get in a very disciplined defense to pause just enough to give you room to work. That's what the game plan was against Cal. The purpose against Carolina with those similar concepts and similar philosophy, even though the game plan will be different, is now you're hoping to create a crease that Chris Tyree can split for a big game. You're trying to out-leverage them with a motion and then a shift, you know, where you're trying to out-leverage them in a way where you're on a jet or a outside zone or something like that, where you're trying to out-leverage them and then you're gonna gash them. That's the difference. So I don't want it to be a ground and pound thing. I want it to be we're going to pound on them because this is who we are. This is who we want to be, looking at it from the Notre Dame offensive standpoint. But we're also looking to create big plays with the run game. And I think that's a big part of it as well, because there's too much talent for them not to be better than what they've been. And you hope that the Cal game was kind of a step in the right direction. Because I would say going for 147 against Cal is getting to about North Carolina's average, about 190 against the North Carolina, relatively speaking. I don't know if that's going to be quite good enough with the way the pass game has been, Ryan. I think it needs to be a more dominant, big play performance. And even beyond the total yards, this is the number I'm going to have my biggest eye on in this game. It's the yards per carry. That needs to start going way up moving forward.
Well, one thing that I'm really looking forward to, Brian, is we talked all offseason about the Harry Hiestand effect and the talent that they have on the offensive line if you're Notre Dame, right? And we've seen spurts of good stuff over the first 3 games, but it's not been nearly good enough. I want to see Notre Dame impose their will a little bit on this North Carolina defensive front, this front 7 just in general, because they have talent. There's no doubt. I mean, you mentioned Desmond Evans, you mentioned Miles Murphy, you mentioned Noah Taylor. Both the linebackers, although inconsistent, Cedric Gray, I mean, like, they have talent, right? Like, they're not like bad athletes in any sense. But for Notre Dame to make me feel better about where they're going, I need to see that glimpse into that offensive line this week, man. I need to see Blake Fisher pissed off this week, right? Like, I need to see this entire offensive line playing with a sense of urgency and moving the line of scrimmage, because let's call it what it is. The front 7 for North Carolina is not a good unit. It's not. The front 7, the run-stopping team, I mean, you can see the graphic and kind of come to that conclusion, right? But it's on film. They are not nearly as good of football players in the front 7 as they are talented, right? So they're a type of team that I think if Notre Dame comes out and they punch them in the mouth a little bit, I don't know if they'll punch back, if I'm being completely honest. Like, this is the game where you impose the will. We've been excited about that maturation of the offensive line. This is the week to see it, because that will lead to this key matchup of if Notre Dame's able to establish and have a big game running the football. 200-plus yards. That's my expectations for this week for Notre Dame's rushing offense.
Yep. Let's dive into the pass game, Ryan, and the Notre Dame pass offense against the North Carolina pass defense. Similarly bad. Not a whole lot is different here. Neither are necessarily very good in this part of the game. I think that with Notre Dame, I think it's the competition has been different, but you can't keep using that excuse. The competition hasn't been so tough. It's not like past years where you start the season with like Michigan State, and Purdue, right? Like, it's Marshall and Cal, right? And so Notre Dame's numbers are slightly better. I win advantage Notre Dame here, but it's debatable. It's absolutely debatable. It's not one where I felt like, oh, yeah, Notre Dame. But they do hold an advantage in, I mean, just about every category. They're ranked higher than North Carolina in just about every discernible category in this regard, especially when you consider they have played 2 quality defenses so far. Advantage Notre Dame, but it's got to be a bigger advantage. This is the part of the game more than anything that has to get a lot better, because teams are just going to – North Carolina is going to do what Cal and Marshall and Ohio State did, and what Oklahoma State did in the second half of their game, and what every team that played Notre Dame tough at the beginning of last year did. Put numbers in the box. Don't let them rip you the pass game or run game. Make Drew Pine beat you. They're going to do that. Now, is North Carolina capable schematically or skill-wise to do that? I don't know. But I would have also told you that neither was Marshall. And so, but they did. And so this is a game where the pass game, Ryan, it's a slight advantage Notre Dame. But I don't feel good about it if you're Notre Dame. I mean, this is a part of the game that is the biggest concern, because if your rush offense is going early, Ryan, and you do get some success early in the ground game, North Carolina's just going to say, nope, not doing it. They're just going to start bringing fires and overloaded boxes to the point where, like, you're not going to have anywhere to work. If the pass game doesn't complement them more this game than it did last week, they're going to have a hard time scoring enough points to win this game. Because to your point, I don't think this is a game you win 20-17 or 24-17. I don't think it's going to be that. I mean, Notre Dame defense could play really well and hold North Carolina to 24-20 and still give up 24 to 27 points, right? Now, they could play lights out like they did a couple years ago. They could do that, but you can't ask them to keep holding this Carolina offense down Eventually your offense is going to have to wake up. And the only way that happens for Notre Dame is if this part of the game right here gets a lot better in a hurry. It doesn't mean throwing 87 bombs. They've got to be more efficient. They've got to take advantage of the plays that are still there, complete passes, and then do more. Tommy Rees needs to continue to get more creative with what he's doing formationally and motion-wise and play action game and different things like that. Is if North Carolina is being aggressive, you've got to do things where you're building your pass game into your run game and vice versa. RPOs against Carolina are very successful. Play action shots can be very successful against Carolina as well. And when you get one-on-ones, don't be afraid to take them. I think that's the big thing for me is if you're not willing to take those shots, then, you're going to be in trouble. I mean, look, App State threw for 361 yards and 6 touchdowns against this defense. I mean, stop talking to me about it's a talent problem when I'm looking at that. When I'm looking at North Carolina, when I'm looking at FAMU passing for 71%, completing 71.8% of their passes and throwing for 279 yards against this North Carolina team. When I'm seeing FAMU do that, don't talk to me about talent. Don't talk to me about it's a talent problem. It's a coaching problem, and it's a player focus problem. It's a player execution problem, and it's a coaches not getting the right people. So forget all this other stuff about what you want to be offensively and NFL stuff and all. Look, put your best flipping players in the field. Get Chris Tyree involved from snap one. Give Drew Pine some chances to throw the ball downfield. Stop coaching scared. Stop coaching like you're afraid your players are going to make a mistake. Put flipping Tobias Merriweather out there, and when he makes a mistake, you say, yeah, of course, he's a freaking freshman. He's going to make mistakes. Put Eli Raridan out there and let your talented kids go make plays. That's the only way this thing is going to work for Notre Dame is stop trying to go win with Jaden Thomas and Matt Salerno being a focal point of your offense because you want to run a bunch of stuff. Get your dudes out there. Take some chances, and then when the opportunities come for Drew Pine, he needs to hit those throws. And I think that getting last week under his belt, I think is going to be big for Drew. You got the start out of your way, you got the nerves out of your way, you got the W. Now just calm down and go be you. And I'm hoping that results in Drew getting some of the – because he did – a year ago, he's the Conor McGregor strut kid throwing TD passes against Wisconsin. And this last week, he looked like a guy that was afraid to make a mistake. Like, okay, you got that out of your way. Get back to the swagger kid. Get back to the dude that was launching bombs against Kobe Bryant and beating having Braden Lindsey beating the Jim Thorpe Award winner for a touchdown to turn a game that you were down 17-0 into a 17-13 game, right? That's what I want to see. Get back to that kid. And if you do that against North Carolina, Ryan, this right here will be a Notre Dame victory in this particular matchup. I'm not saying victory in the game, but this particular matchup. That's what they need to see. But also, Tommy Rees needs to help them by giving them the best players to work with. That's a big part of this for me too.
100%. I mean, it's a full effort here, and there's no excuses. There's not. I mean, you talked about, Brian, the first 3 games North Carolina's played. All due respect to Mr. Musa from Florida A&M. All due respect to Chase Bryce, who by the way, Chase Bryce lost his top 3 receivers from last year for App State. And all due respect to Darren Granger, who's a pretty decently talented kid from Georgia State, who also, by the way, lost his most talented receiver, Sam Pinckney, last year, this offseason. If they're having that much success passing the football against North Carolina, I don't care if your backup quarterback's in for Notre Dame. I don't care. I don't care if you haven't been playing well.
Chase Bryce is a kid that had 10 touchdowns and 15 interceptions the last time he was starting as a Power 5 quarterback.
Yep. It
It
illustrates. No, you're 100% right. I mean, it strengthens my opinion here, right? There's zero excuses. I don't want to. If you come out of this game and you're just like, well, we have some flaws in our passing game. We're not playing well. No, it's not an excuse against this unit. I'm sorry. It's not. You see these graphics, people, right? Like 11 touchdowns in 3 games. Brian already mentioned the 6 touchdowns that Chase Bryce threw against this team. There's zero.
Florida A&M, Appalachian State, and Georgia State.
Yes.
Repeat that again. FAMU, App State, Georgia State.
It's zero excuses, man. Zero. I don't want to hear about it anymore. This is a part of the game you have to win. You have to. There's no excuses. Yeah. I mean, Brian, like you're so much more. You're not. Actually, let me backtrack for a second. North Carolina's secondary is very talented from an athleticism perspective on the back end, right? You have Tony Grimes, you have Storm Duck, you have Cameron Kelly. They have some guys in theory, but it doesn't matter because they're not good right now, right? This is a bad pass defense. There is zero excuses. I don't want to come to the post-game show on Saturday and say like, oh man, just not good. No, it's not an excuse. It's not an excuse. Oh, your quarterback's only making a second start. I don't care. Your wide receivers aren't playing. I don't care. There's no excuses. I'm done with the excuses for this pass offense when you're playing against this pass defense. Zero excuses. You have to get this one done.
So I think a big part of this, too, is protection. The offensive line has to give the quarterback time. We saw them do a much better job of that last week. That has to continue. I really like Noah Taylor. I do. I liked him at Virginia. He had a sack against Notre Dame back in 2019. I really like I've always liked him. Long-range kid. He just hasn't been able to stay healthy a lot, right? I mean, that's been a big problem for him. He's had some injuries, but he's a good player. Miles Murphy's a kid that's got some ability as a pass rusher up the middle. Not a ton, but he's got some. Rafa Hasek is a big physical kind of plug up the middle that allows blitzers to kind of come through. So there's some talent there. It's just about, but you got to execute your game because it's not the kind of talent that it's like this. It's like Marshall. It's the kind of talent that if you don't play your game and you're not playing sound football, they're going to beat you. But it's also not the kind of talent where if you bring your A game or even your B+ game, you're going to give the quarterback time to throw. I thought the offensive line did a very good job of that in quarters 2, 3, and 4 against Cal. I keep saying Marshall for some reason. Against Cal. I thought after really the first couple series, I thought Drew Pine had plenty of time to throw. If you can continue that against North Carolina, then that's going to give him an opportunity to have some success. And look, this is not North Carolina's got a good fan base. It's not a big stadium. I've been there. It's not a super, super loud stadium. It's a little bit of a smaller crowd situation. So it's not like 77,000. This isn't like 110,000 people at your stadium, right? And it's a good fan base, but it's not going to be the kind of hostile environment. It's 3:30 afternoon game. It's not the kind of hostile environment that you can use as an excuse for why you weren't able to get calls and or get plays made. The reality is the opportunities are there. Notre Dame is going to have to capitalize. I think Notre Dame has the advantage going into this game, Ryan. Now it needs to turn from an on-paper matchup advantage into a real advantage. But that's only going to happen if we see some continued scheme involvement, if we see more of Tobias Merriweather and Eli Raridan using Michael Mayer in some different ways, and then starting to kind of build your pass game around what you have talent-wise instead of who you want to be. This is who Braden Lindsey is. Use him that way. This is who Lorenzo Styles is. Use him that way. And I think that's going to be a big part of it. So that's what I'm hoping that we see. It's what needs to happen. Will we see it? Remains to be seen.
I mean, we've talked about it a ton, Brian. Like the pass catchers, just in general, it's a position where you can simplify things and you can take advantage of strengths that they all have, right? I mean, I forget if we talked about this on a show, Brian, or like if we talked about it just kind of off air, but why is Braden Lindsey just running outside vertical stem routes? Why isn't he working across the middle? Why isn't he getting screens? Why isn't he doing that type of work on top of some of the other stuff he's doing, right? Like Lorenzo Styles, ask him to do everything that he's comfortable with. Michael Mayer, right. The one good thing with last week's game, although you weren't able to complete it, at least I saw him run a seam route at last week's game, right? Like I want to see all these different skill sets that these guys have, but you don't have to ask them to be something that they aren't. No. Ask them to be what they are. Because if you do it, you can compartmentalize roles and it will all fit together well. Who cares if Tobias Merriweather doesn't know the full offense? You can get him out there, you can run 3 routes, and he can give you some reps and potentially make some plays. Ask these guys to do what they do well. The same thing with your quarterback, right? I don't care who the quarterback is against this pass defense. Ask Drew Pine to do things that he is comfortable doing and get confidence into his game. You do that, and I think that Notre Dame's going to have a good day through the air. But until we see that, I'm going to have some concerns. But there's enough talent for it to happen. Right. Certainly,
Talent's not an excuse for this game. I'm sorry. No, it just isn't. Again, Jeremy Musa went 28 of 38 for 279 yards. Right. Just stop with the excuses. Get it done. If you can't do it this week, then you have a coaching problem. Put Braden Lindsey in the slot. Do different. And here's the thing: you last week you had the great chance to push the ball down the field. and you didn't do it against a bunch of 5'10" corners. This week, you're going up against a couple 6'1" corners. That's even more reason to get Braden Lindsey in the slot. Don't put Braden Lindsey outside all game and say, okay, dude, go run comebacks and curl routes and go routes on the perimeter in the boundary against a couple 6'1" physical experienced corners. If you do that, that's not a Braden Lindsey problem. That's a you problem, because no good coach is going to ask Braden Lindsey to do those things against anybody, much less these corners. So again, if the coaching is right this week, then I think the offense will shine. It's as simple as that. And let's kind of get into the last aspect of this matchup, Ryan. Notre Dame scoring offense against the North Carolina scoring defense. I did not think it was possible for Notre Dame's offense, which ranks 115th in the nation in scoring and 114th in total yards and 104th in yards per play, to actually go into a game with better numbers than the opponent. And that's how bad North Carolina's defense is. This is ridiculous. Like, it is ridiculous. And the crazy thing is, this number right here completely, it's like when they're getting in the red zone, they're scoring, but it's this number right here is a big problem. It's a big problem. They are not a big play offense, and they are not an offense that's been able to move the chains. And look, and they've been missing on some normal third down situations too, Ryan. Like, they've been in some third and longs, but like Notre Dame's been getting in like 3rd and 4s, 3rd and 5s, and it's not converting. And then, of course, they get into the 3rd and 1s and 3rd and 3s, get stupid penalties. Exactly. So it's not like they're just getting dominated on 1st and 2nd down. They stink on 3rd down. The interesting thing for me, Ryan, and this is where I kind of, I guess, have some hope for this offense that it can kind of get right, is that this has been a strength for Notre Dame in the past under Tommy Rees. They've actually had some pretty good 3rd down offenses in the past. And it's like last year they were 46, but they got much better as the year went on. But in 2010, his first year, they were 7th in 3rd down offense. And, you just kind of, if you could just get somewhat kind of close to being that team again, then I think this team has a chance to be successful against this North Carolina defense, because you got to be able to move the chains, because the more first downs you convert, obviously the more plays you run, the greater opportunity there is that you can make a big play. And that's going to be the big key. You have to move the chains and then create big play opportunities. If you can do that, then I think they'll be successful. And look, North Carolina has had a tough time stopping teams on 3rd down. They haven't been a big turnover force team, and their red zone defense has been pretty bad. So all the markers are there for this Notre Dame team to be able to go out and have success. And when you look at North Carolina, Ryan, and you look at their kind of their production this year, it's not like they had a bad game that got them to this point. A&M went 2 of 3 in the red zone for touchdowns. App State went 3 of 3 in the red zone for touchdowns. Georgia State went 1 of 1 in the red zone for touchdowns. So, all 3 of their opponents have done it. And you look at their 3rd down defense, they gave up 50% to App State, 38.5% to Florida A&M. They did a better job on 3rd down against Georgia State, but Georgia State's not very good on offense. But they at least improved in game 3, right? And that's going to be the interesting part, is they did get better in game 3 against Georgia State in that regard. They had some other issues against Georgia State that weren't necessarily all on the defense, but their defense also had some issues in that game as well. Georgia State's last touchdown drive was 10 plays, 98 yards. You know what I mean? Like, but it's going to be interesting to kind of see how this plays out, Ryan. It is. But you got to hit some big plays in this game.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you picked out the 3rd down offensive performance from Notre Dame so far, because that was actually one of the first things that I noticed on the graphic, honest, when you kind of were just starting to talk. And it's so funny, Brian, like when you think about just the struggles they've had, you start thinking about, Notre Dame getting stuffed on 3rd and 4th and 1 against Marshall. You start thinking about the false start penalties, and it's just been ugly, man. Like, it is. Like, I talk to myself sometimes when I watch football games, and my wife makes fun of me, but like usually on like 3rd downs when Notre Dame needs a big 3rd down, or the team that I'm rooting for, I'll just say, like, just get the conversion and breathe, right? Like, get the conversion and breathe, because it's a high stress situation at that point, right? 3rd downs are very high stress, and it's been a killer to my psyche and the Notre Dame psyche so far this year. The fact that they have been just so bad on 3rd down, right? And again, this is one thing has to break here, right? Either North Carolina is going to come out of this game and say, like, defensively, we feel a ton better about what we have been over the first 3 games. This is where it's going to go better for us. Or you're going to look at Notre Dame and you're going to say, oh, this is the get right game. This could be a get right game for both of these units on this board. The question is, who's it going to be? But it's going to be a big tell, again, how explosive Notre Dame could be against this team. I need to see some big plays. It needs to happen. If you're just a ground and pound team against this team, I'm not sure that that's I don't think that that's a recipe for success, because I think Notre Dame is going to get the threat of making themselves too one-dimensional, if that's just the point of emphasis, right? So it's going to be interesting to watch.
And I think
you don't like Carolina barbecue? You don't like
Carolina
barbecue? Sorry, I just saw that in the chat.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I do not. Somebody asked me if I was going to get some Carolina barbecue. I am not. The only place I've had barbecue in the Carolinas that I've really liked, there's a place in Clemson called the Smoking Pig, which has got some really good barbecue. We enjoyed it there, but it wasn't like what I got. I got pulled pork and I got brisket, and it wasn't really vinegar based. I don't like the vinegar based barbecue.
Yeah, so vinegar is not the best. Good point.
Yeah, that's my
good point.
It's
not as bad as the Alabama sauce or whatever, like the white sauce.
Yeah, I've never had that before.
I would never suggest it.
Yes. It's not my thing. I remember first time I ever had it was I was actually my freshman year of college. I actually went to college in North Carolina, in Vietnam, and I had some barbecue down there. I was like, yeah, this is not good. I'm not a fan. It could have just been that place, but I'm not a fan. But anyway, back to this conversation. Ryan got startled when I put that comment in there. This is where I think Notre Dame not having Avery Davis has hurt the most, because Avery Davis was kind of Tommy Rees's third down security blanket. You know what I mean? Like, he would design stuff that he would always like have a plan, a Mayer / Avery Davis third down plan. Right. And I don't think he trusts the current group of receivers as much as he did Avery. Understandably so. I mean, when Lorenzo Styles is dropping a ball on third down that hits him right in the hands, that's not Drew Pine's fault. That's not Tommy Rees's fault. That's Lorenzo's fault, right? He's got to make that play. And he's capable of making that play. He's a very talented player. He's just got to make the play. When other guys are doing things that you're just saying, hey, the call's there, you got to execute it. So he's going to have to figure out who's my third down guys other than Michael Mayer, because teams are looking at Michael Mayer on third down. They're keying on him on third down. Who's going to become your new third down weapons? And somebody's got to step up and say, hey, coach, third down, get me the rock. And that's where Avery Davis was like, he was just that kind of the guy. Like, when it was third down, I was like, okay, all right, I've been hanging out the first couple downs, but now this is my down. This is my down. Yeah. And that's where, not having Avery's hurt there, if we're going to be honest. I mean, not having Avery doesn't excuse all of this, right? Because other people haven't stepped up. But that's the one scenario where it has hurt and nobody else has stepped up. But you've got to find some other weapons. You've got to find some other options on third down, because you can't keep doing that. They're not good enough at the skill positions, in my opinion, to win the rest of their games if they're anywhere close to that. Because the only way you can win the games left on your schedule, the next 9 games, with a third down offense that bad, is if you're just ripping off 50-yard plus touchdown after 50-plus yard touchdown. That's it.
Yep.
And there aren't many teams good enough to do that. There just aren't. So that's going to have to be an area that's going to improve. So I give Notre Dame the slight advantage here, Ryan, in this matchup. I do. I think it's all of them are close to even. I just think that this matchup is slightly favors Notre Dame because of the red zone difference is really the big thing for me. Is where I see this being a potential area for success. And I think that's an area where Notre Dame can and should continue to have success. If they can keep that red zone success and then start moving the ball more effectively, you're going to see the points per game jump way up, because that's how you score, right? I mean, every time we get in the end zone or in the red zone, we're getting touchdowns. And just so you know, for me, and I'm confident Ryan agrees with me, I don't care much about that number in the red zone. I care about that number in the red zone. I care about the 100%. Touchdown percentage. You can be a bad scoring offense and a high red zone team, but if you're not giving, and you could be a team that, like Notre Dame last year, was it last year that Notre Dame had might have been Clark Lee's last year. But there was a year recently where Notre Dame's red zone defense ranked like in the 90s, because teams, when they would get in the red zone, would score a lot. It was Clark Lee's last defense in 2020. They ranked 89th in the country in red zone defense. They ranked 23rd in touchdown defense. What that meant was they were playing kickers that were making all their field goals. They couldn't stop people from making field goals. Now, this is a bit of a bend but don't break defense in 2020, right? But they were holding teams to field goals. But you had a hard time scoring on that team in the red zone. I'd much rather have that than a team who, like North Carolina, they're when teams get into the red zone, they're scoring touchdowns, right? Like you don't want to be there. I don't care what your red zone. The 100% doesn't bother me if I'm a North Carolina fan. It's because it's early in the year. It's only 7 possessions. It's this number. Like if they were giving up 1,000 or 100%, but they three of the 7 were touchdowns and the others were field goals, and you'd be okay. We're not that we'll get it figured out. So I think that's kind of the way that I'd look at it, Ryan. So that's kind of how I view this particular aspect of this matchup.
Yep. I think it's perfectly illustrated, man. It's a bad versus bad. Somebody's going to come out on top, and it's going to be another huge indicator of who's going to win this football game, because right now both units are struggling, but it's going to be who is, I think the more mentally tough team is a good way to put it, Brian, because, let's call a spade, right? Like Notre Dame offense right now doesn't have much confidence, I wouldn't assume, right? The North Carolina defense, I would assume does not have much confidence right now. So this is a game where you build confidence. So interesting to see how this one unfolds.
Let's dive into the defensive matchup here, Ryan. And let's start with Notre Dame's run defense against North Carolina's rush offense. This is a huge advantage for North Carolina on paper, and not just on paper, practically. North Carolina has run the football well. Notre Dame has struggled to stop the run. That includes against a Marshall team that honestly isn't that good with its rushing offense. They're not as good as Notre Dame made them out to be. They weren't that good running the football against Norfolk State. It was mostly just their players were better than the other players. And, they ran it okay against Bowling Green, right? 191, 5.2 yards per carry. That's a solid day. The Notre Dame made them look like world beaters in the run game. And they're just not good. They were much better against Cal. Now, where they gave up numbers against Cal rushing were the quarterback scrambles in the pass game. But as far as just pure running, outside of 2 plays, they were very good. The difference is this is a much more complex running attack, not so much schematically, Ryan, but because of all the other stuff that they do. It's a much more complicated I don't even think complex is and complicated is the right word. I think the thing that I would say it's more of more of a challenge to stop because of all the other stuff they do, the motions, the shifts, the screen game, the RPO game, where you could have, there's things they could do where if they play North Carolina the same way they played Cal, they're pulling the ball out and throwing behind it. Right. And that's what makes it challenging. So, and even it's the wildest thing, Ryan, we both talked about this. I'll watch North Carolina and be like, their running game's just blah. It's just meh. It's just there. Then you look at the numbers, like, oh, they ran for 240. Okay, that's weird. It's just because it's not a real physical offensive line, and that's my big knock on Phil Longo. He can get more physicality out of this offense. He needs to. That's the only thing holding him back. And there's good talent running back, but not great talent. You just kind of watch them and you're just like, I'm not really blown away. And then all of a sudden you look down and they got 200 plus yards a game. And it's the darndest thing. It really is the darndest thing.
It's strange to watch. It really is. Like, it's because, like you said, the offensive line's not great. The running backs, Marion Hampton's a talented player. Sure. George Pettaway is a talented player. Caleb Hood, they're not
Javonte Williams and Michael Carter. Right,
not even close. Not even close.
That's one where I loved watching those guys run, because you're like, these are dudes. These are NFL kids. These are dudes.
Javonte Williams is in my top 5 of players over the last 10 or 15 years that I would not want to tackle in college football, man. That dude was a runaway freight train. And then the very next play, you have 5'8", 195 Michael Carter coming into the game, who's super shifty, right? That's the guy that actually, if I remember correctly, in Notre Dame's 2020 game, it was Michael Carter that actually had more explosive runs than Javonte had that day, right? I think they had a pretty good attack as far as stopping Javonte Williams, but that's kind of they're definitely more Javonte Williams types of this running back, at least from a style perspective. Like Amarian Hampton's 220 pounds, and he's a downhill type of kid, right? Caleb Hood's kind of a 220 plus pound kid. George Petway is a little bit of a bigger back as well. So these are true downhill runners. They're not incredibly elusive or creative as running backs. And it's I don't know, Brian, if you agree with this, but like in a typical Phil Longo system, I feel like the running game is kind of where they want to be, right? And then the passing game is I don't want to say an extension, but like it's a pretty balanced attack for the most part. I feel like the running game is kind of more of an extension this year of the passing game, but they kind of lull you to sleep a little bit is kind of the best way I would phrase it. So there's some talent, but I didn't watch any of those running backs run and just go like, oh man, that guy worries me, you know? Like, again, good running backs, just to your point, there's not a Javonte Williams in that group right now. There's not a Ty Chandler even in that group, in my opinion, right now.
I think you're right, Ryan. I think in the past, the run game is where he wanted to start. He understood if we can establish the running game, it's going to make our vertical passing game so much better. It's going to make our screen game so much better. And it was typical of what we've said in the past. It was an inside-out build. Most teams are inside-out builds. We've seen teams that have been successful with the reverse. Alabama in 2020 was the reverse of that. LSU in 2019 was the reverse of that. They were an outside-in team, right? And there's not a right or wrong. It's just what most people do. And I prefer the inside-out build if all things are equal. I think Notre Dame right now, as I've said, has to reverse engineer their offense a little bit and go more outside in. And that's what North Carolina's done so far, Ryan, is they haven't had the talent up front to just hammer people. I think their backs are they have talent in the backfield. It's just not Michael Carter, Javonte Williams, but those guys can play.
Very young running backs.
Right.
Yeah.
Their offensive line's their issue. It's like you had said something to me. You texted me the other day when you were watching some film. You said, dude, if they could block, this offense would be almost unstoppable. And that's the crazy thing, because you're saying that about a team that's averaging 237.3 rushing yards per game. And that's what makes it wild, right, Ryan, that's what's like, okay, hold on a second. Like, you know, and that's the feeling. I hadn't started diving into the App State and the Georgia State film yet, but that was the impression that I came away with after the opener against A&M. Or Florida A&M, where, I know the yards were there, but I even said on this show, I was like, I wasn't impressed with their run game. Like, I know the yards were there, but I wasn't impressed with their run game. And I wasn't overly impressed with their run game against App State. I wasn't impressed with it against Georgia State. But then you look at the numbers, and it's like, okay, but they're getting their yards. That's the key, and that's what Clark Lee's game plan in 2020 was all about. Clark Lee said, if you're going to beat us, you're going to have to beat us throwing the ball down the field. And early on, they did, Ryan. And they hit a couple big plays early, but after the first couple series, Notre Dame figured that out. Clarence Lewis came in, really settled things down, and they shut them down because they were not going to allow North Carolina to get the run game going. Al Golden's going to have to take a similar approach. My concern is that he was going to go, and from what I'm told, he was going in that route against Marshall and then just reverse course and went with more of a passing-oriented game plan, and it crushed them, because they were not prepared to defend the run. I'm concerned that they're going to have a pass-oriented game plan against North Carolina, and it's going to allow them to rip them with the run game, which is going to allow that offense to just start leaning on Notre Dame, which then opens up – then Brandon Joseph has to get more involved in the run game, and then that's going to open up some big play opportunities down the field. And they take so many shots down the field that they're going to hit a few if they're allowed to get the run game going. What they did in 2020 is they took the run game out schematically, but also just the D-line dominated. I mean, they dominated that. There was a third down play where Adi Ogundeji was actually in the game, comes off the ball, just hammers the defense, the offensive tackle. Javonte actually it might have been Michael Carter. One of the two running backs bounces it. He basically just disengages and chases him down at the line of scrimmage. I mean, just because it was a great set edge where he knocks guy back, forces the bounce, but he never let the guy get into his body. So he just, because he had such long arms, he just never let him get his body, and he just comes off and makes the play. And they're just like North Carolina guys were making cuts and getting like 4 or 5 yards past the line of scrimmage, but they were 2-yard gains. Not the line of scrimmage, getting like 3 to 4 yards, 5 yards past the offensive line. But they were only 2-yard gains because Notre Dame was just driving the Carolina guys in the back, because it is a slow passive running attack. It's inside zone that kind of looks like mid zone, right? If somebody told me it was mid zone, I wouldn't be surprised. It's outside zone, it's counter, it's G wrap, it's quarterback draw, all stuff with there's passivity to how the offensive line plays. A good defense, and this is why Clemson constantly dominates Wake Forest. And we'll see if they can do it again this week, because Clemson, so many teams, the mistake they make against Wake Forest is, okay, we can't be too aggressive because they're going to pull and throw. And Clemson says, no, forget that. We're going to push their offensive line into the quarterback and not give him the time to do that crazy slow read, because we're going to push his guards right into the quarterback. That's and that's what Stanford used to do to Oregon. We've talked about this. Crash the mesh, right? Force him to declare where he's going to go with the ball. Same thing with the triple option. I've been arguing for years. Best way to attack the triple option is best way to stop the triple option is to attack it. Force the quarterback to declare early, because if he's got a pitch before he gets to the edge of the line or to the perimeter, you now know where the back is going, and they've never had great backs. It's the same way against Carolina. If they want to run this stuff, then you freaking take that offense. If you're the defensive end and you've got to set the edge and you see a guy pulling, then you take that offensive tackle and you drive him right into the puller. Drive him right into the puller, right? And that's how you stop this run game. Be aggressive up front. Gap discipline is important. It's not just everybody shoot through a million gaps, but be aggressive, reset the line of scrimmage, and then attack. If you do that, then that allows you to stop them with your box. If you can stop their run game with your box, you've got a chance. If you have to start getting your safeties and your rover and your corners more involved in the run game, that's where they become dangerous, because then those guys start peaking, and that's when the RPO and the play action game starts ripping you for big plays. If you can dominate the line of scrimmage, drive them back, be aggressive. If he takes a passive, defend the width of the field, protect the pass game type of approach, then North Carolina is going to have success running the football, which means success overall, in my opinion. There's no doubt.
I mean, the starting point for me is that the offensive line's not good. You mentioned that already, right? I think the left tackle is their best player, and even he is maddeningly inconsistent, right? The right tackle is not very good. Center's fine. Right guard is not very good, and left guard is fine, right? So you have two okay players basically on your offensive line if you're North Carolina. You need to dominate the line of scrimmage, Brian, because you showed that rushing attack that can kind of lull you to sleep, right? Well, can't lull you to sleep this week, man. You got to dominate up front. And then the other big thing is, if you're playing aggressively, I understand that Drake May is a pretty good athlete. He's a solid athlete, right? He's had some pretty good rushing numbers so far. He's another guy that off script plays can run the football and kind of scramble and do all those types of things. But again, we saw it last year with Sam Howell. You need to get the quarterback on the ground, man. This is a game where I think Notre Dame can stop the run to a high degree, but they can't let these scrambles just kind of extend drives and convert third downs and do all that type of stuff. It's up to the defensive line to create pressure and finish, but also the linebackers need to be a lot better this week. They have to be. This is one where I don't necessarily want to spy Drake May all the time, because I don't think he's that much of a rushing threat. But he can't break the pocket, and then your linebacker just whiffs or is late in pursuit or takes a bad angle heading to the sideline, like we saw Maris Loifow last week, right? So that's the biggest thing, is that we've talked about not only the running game being at a good rate so far, but also the quarterback has been a little bit of an extender too. So the first and second levels of this Notre Dame defense need to finish plays. They have to. This second effort runs and scrambles have to be eliminated in this game. You have to be able to win on first contact, win early in reps, and you do that because of what you just said. Be aggressive. Go for it, man. Cause mayhem. Cause chaos. That's how Notre Dame wins this game up front. And their defensive line versus the offensive line should, again, in theory, on paper, be a massive advantage for Notre Dame. They have to go out and do it, but I'll take Isaiah Foskey against either one of these offensive tackles. I'll take Jason Ademilola against any interior offensive lineman, excuse me. This is another game where your dudes need to be dudes on the defensive side of the ball.
Because to your point, Ryan, I agree with everything you just said, but I also would have said the same thing last year. And North Carolina rushed for 224 yards against Notre Dame last year. And so yes, you are correct, but it comes down to execution, and then it does come down to containing the quarterback. North Carolina went for 565 and 7.9 yards per carry against Notre Dame last year. If that happens again this year, it will be a loss, in my opinion. I think it will be a loss. So they're going to have to execute better, like you said. They're going to have to control the line of scrimmage. When you get shots in the backfield, and you will, make the plays. I think you nailed. That's the big part, Ryan, that you hit on. If you get a chance for a minus, you got to get a minus. You have to get a minus, and that's where this team needs to be. So run game is going to be a very intriguing matchup. Slowing that part of it down is going to be very, very important. Notre Dame did not do a great job of that last year against Carolina. They did a tremendous job of that in 2020. I mean, here's what North Carolina's rushing numbers were that year before. They had a 338-yard game, a 326-yard game, a 394-yard game, a 184-yard game against Carolina. In a year game, they threw for 374. They had 192 against Wake Forest the week before. They were coming in 2020. They were coming off a game. They scored 59 points. They had scored back-to-back 50-point games. And really, they had scored at least 41 in 4 straight games. 794, 42 yards and 8.9 yards per play is what they were averaging coming in that game. Notre Dame held them to 298 yards of offense, 87 rushing. And that's where it was about. It's dominating in the trenches, which stopped the run game, made you able to defend everything else. And when you consider how many yards Carolina had, they had almost 100 yards on the first 2 drives alone when they jumped out to a 14-7 lead. Notre Dame settled down and really dominated. They didn't really cross midfield again until the second half when they had their field goal drive. And a lot of that was without Kyle Hamilton. So it's because what they do that day, Ryan, they dominated the trenches. And when they had opportunities to get minuses, they got minuses. And that's the thing that's going to be different about this. So let's go to the pass game, Ryan. This is a very intriguing matchup. I actually think I gave this one an even matchup, to be honest with you. Now, the reason why is I do think that Notre Dame's numbers relative to North Carolina's are similar, even just without context. When you look at the context, I think that's where you start getting a little bit more impressed by this matchup, because when you consider that part of it is Notre Dame played a team in Ohio State that had the number 1 pass offense in the country last year. They played them in the opener, and that was obviously a big part of the success that they had. I think holding Ohio State to 223 yards. It's a pretty good day's work. Marshall had the best yards per attempt against Notre Dame at 6.9. So it's not like the 5-point ago against Cal dragged the number way down, and it's not as impressive. I mean, North Carolina or Ohio State was only 6.6. The highest quarterback rating an opponent has had so far is 149.9 by Cal or by Marshall, right? CJ Stroud was only at 145.1. So when you look at what Ohio State normally does, the next week against Arkansas State, 226. The next week against Toledo, 256.73. You just don't see that from Ohio State very often. So I think that the context of the competition is why I think you can argue that it's an even matchup for Notre Dame. But there's a theme, Ryan, that exists in this matchup that also exists in the previous one, and it's right here. This is the big thing right here. And it like when you talk about playing defense, it's about the great defense is doing one thing, then helps you be better at the other thing. If you're dominating line of scrimmage in the run game with aggressiveness and controlling lanes and controlling edges and things like that, you're also going to have success in the pass game. The best blitzing teams on first and second down are teams that use run blitzes that then go through the run to the quarterback if it's a pass, right? And that's the best scheme things, as opposed to just a pass blitz on first down or a run blitz on first down. That's if they're not running, you're kind of in trouble. If somebody better peel back. And that's going to be the big part of it. And now the caveat is they get Josh Downs back in this game. That's going to be an important part of it, right? Getting Josh Downs is a dude. And that's why this matchup right here is so important. You cannot give Drake May time, because here's the thing about Drake May. One of the things I like about him as an evaluator of him, regardless of what the matchup about Notre Dame is, just me watching the kid's film, he's a tough kid, Ryan. He's shown some toughness in his first few starts. Like, he will hang in there and take a shot. He will take some chances. He's a very confident quarterback. I like that personally. I like that. I like a kid that's even bordering on cocky, as long as it's not disrespectful. And no, that's not a shot at what he said about NC State. That was funny. Okay, lighten up, people. Right? That was funny.
I can't believe that was even a story, man. That was so lame.
People
so lame.
Don't even get me started on the sensitivity of our culture right now. But it was funny. And as someone who spent a year in the state of North Carolina in college, that's been around before Drake May was born. Okay, that joke's been around in every state school, every state in the country. Anyway, just like they joke about how kids from Carolina can't get into Duke, right? I mean, whatever, lighten up. However, when I look at this kid, the thing I love about him is the thing that could play into Notre Dame's favor if the defensive line dominates, because he will take some chances. And if you can harass him enough, some of those chances are going to be plays where you can make a play on the ball. Notre Dame, here's a crazy thing. In the previous 13 years, going back all the way to 2009. So, Ryan, this is wild. Going all the way back to 2009, I have not been able to find any period of time where Notre Dame went more than 2 games without intercepting a pass in the same season. Now, the longest stretch they had was 19-20, the last 2 games of the season to the first 2 games of the season. But in one season, I've never seen it where Notre Dame went 3 games without forcing an interception. And I've never seen them have more than 2 games where they didn't force a turnover, period. So even the stretch of 19-20, that was just interceptions. I'm going back to past years. Last year, they had a stretch of 2 games against North Carolina and Navy. They had a stretch of 2 games in 2020, stretch of 2 games. Actually, I was looking at the turnovers lost. I was like, oh, that's actually better than I thought. No, they had only had 1 game last year that they didn't force a turnover. 1 game the whole year. It was against Navy. The year before, they only had 4 games the whole year that they didn't force turnovers, never more than 1 game in a row. 2019, they had a 2-game stretch against USC and Michigan. Outside of that, they forced at least 1 turnover in every game. The previous year, only 2 games total without a turnover. That's 2018. 2017, they had 3 games total where they didn't force a turnover. 3 games total. 2016, only had 2 games total they didn't force a turnover. 2015, only 2 games total. You get the point, right? A stretch of 3 games without forcing a turnover, I've never seen before from Notre Dame. So does that trend continue, or do they finally get it? Now, the interesting thing is they haven't really been close to a lot of turnovers, to be honest with you. And that's the strange thing. But that's also why the defense has to be impactful, because we started to see Carolina – or Cal forced a couple Cal had a couple turnovers, apparent turnovers in the fourth quarter against Notre Dame. Why? They were both on plays when the quarterback was pressured. You had the interception to Clarence Lewis that got called back because of the dumb play by J.D. Bertrand. And then you had the play that they thought they ruled a fumble he was down, but what did it come off of? Quarterback getting hit, trying to throw the ball away. That's how you make them. When the D-line showed up, you started to see Cal get closer and closer to turnovers, right? That's why this is key, Ryan. If they can dominate in the trenches, harass Drake May, because he's a gutsy, gritty kid, and I say that as a compliment. I like watching this kid play a lot. Yep. And he has a chance to be the best Carolina quarterback in a long time. And, Ryan, you know how much that means for me to say, because you know how much I love Sam Howell, right? Yep. And that's me saying that after 3 games. Now, again, it's early. Let's see him play a team like Notre Dame first. But I really like this kid. But part of the thing I like about him is the thing that can hurt him if a team can harass him. And that's going to be the key. Because if you can consistently get pressure on him, he will force some balls. He will take some chances. He will try to throw a ball that you hit him too quickly and the ball floats and you can make a play. Those are going to be the keys for Notre Dame, because he's never faced the size and speed that he's going to face on Saturday, with all due respect to Georgia State and App State and Florida A&M. He's never faced the kind of talent, length, and size and speed that he's going to face from Notre Dame on Saturday.
It's funny, Brian. I feel like there's 2 different ways of thinking about defense ideologically to forcing turnovers. One is what I think we both agree on, is that pressure creates turnovers, right? And then the other one is, hey, let's play back a little bit. Let's let them nickel and dime us a little bit, but we're going to force them to have to use a lot of plays to score, and more plays equal more opportunities to potentially make a play, right? But I am definitely more on the the former there of creating pressure and creating mayhem and mischief and chaos, or whatever, however you want to coin it. Like I'm a big advocate of pressure, right? So I agree with you in the sense that right now, Drake May is a very confident kid in the pocket, man. Like I put on the board yesterday, boards.irishbreakdown.com, you can see underneath there, just kind of a little rundown of some of their offensive best offensive playmakers. And obviously I started with Drake May, and for a redshirt freshman, I call him unflappable right now. But the thing about it is that he hasn't played a defense that can make him become unflappable, right? Like he hasn't been under a crazy amount of pressure. He's a very rhythmic type of passer where he's just trying to get right into what he's doing. He's pretty methodical when he gets it going, right? But to Brian's point, there are plays where he'll hold the ball and he'll let things develop, and he's very confident inside the pocket. And he has pretty good movement skills for a guy that's a little bit of a bigger cat, 6'4.5", 220 pounds. So this is, again, I go back to it, Brian. We talked about it on the running
Ryan,
game side
he's
of
not
things.
your typical 6'4", 220-pound kid. I mean,
No.
he's a good athlete. I won't be shocked if I found out he played like basketball or baseball or something like that in high school. I
think he did. I'm pretty sure I looked at his bio the other day, and he was a big
Wouldn't shock
don't
me.
quote me on that one.
Yeah,
but
wouldn't shock me.
Yeah, man, he's what I really love about him though, Brian. It's not just quantified by like his ability to run the football. Like he's a good mover in the pocket, right? Like he has subtle movements that kind of buy him a little bit of extra time. But I talked a little bit about the defensive line importance in this game, the front seven importance. It goes from the run game perspective and the pass game perspective. They have to get to this kid, and they have to get him a little bit uncomfortable because the first 3 games of the season wasn't really uncomfortable for him, right? And at the end of the day, although I agree, I think this kid's extremely talented. And my NFL draft hat is already on with this kid. Like, wow, this might be a dude. This might be a guy.
Mm-hmm.
This might be that type of dude. But at the end of the day, though, he's a redshirt freshman that is only starting his 4th football game on the college level, right? So he's still an inexperienced player from a playing time perspective. So if Notre Dame's able to create pressure on this young man, there are some bad decisions that are most likely in the barrel for him, right? There's going to be some time because he's not going to go his entire college career with averaging 1 interception every 4 games, right? Like that's pretty outrageous what he's doing so far. I think that you're going to force mistakes. I think Notre Dame is due for a couple turnovers this game. You have to make Drake May uncomfortable. That's the main thing because we know Josh Downs is incredibly talented. Talked about the tight ends yesterday, Morales and Nesbitt, and even the third stringer is a pretty good football player. Pace Sauer, who filled in while Downs has been out as their leading receiver, is a pretty solid football player. They have weapons. So the biggest thing is that you need to make this kid uncomfortable in the pocket. You need to see if you can get to a point where he is a little flappable. That's the biggest thing for me is the pressure. I think it's really going to showcase just how good this Notre Dame defense can be because right now they're facing a quarterback that has all the confidence in the world with what he's doing.
Yep, absolutely. Let's go to the final piece of this, Ryan, and this is advantage North Carolina. I mean, look, Notre Dame's done a nice job, but Notre Dame has given up points in situations they shouldn't give up. Now, I would argue that that number's a tad misleading, not by a lot, but just a tad, because Notre Dame is a team that gave up a defensive touchdown or an offensive touchdown, I should say. So you take that out, and Notre Dame is giving up. Excuse me, give me a second. I hit the wrong thing. Notre Dame is giving up 19 points a game, so they are sub 20. But still, even then, the points need to be down more. You should have made there's a couple stops against Cal you should have made. There's a couple stops against Marshall you should have made. So Notre Dame defense has been better than their numbers show, but still not nearly good enough, Ryan. And I think there's some aspects of this where they've been able to catch some breaks. They've had a couple missed field goals already, so that kind of counters, the turnover a little bit. But the reality is that North Carolina has been just unstoppable on offense so far. And I mean, they didn't play great against Georgia State and still scored 35 points. And the thing I liked about that game too is they made plays when they needed to make plays, to put the game away. The game wasn't quite as competitive as the final score of 35-28. So I think this is advantage North Carolina, but for Notre Dame, it comes down to the previous stuff, dominating the trenches, so that way you can get North Carolina. Here's a big part of North Carolina's success right here. Is their ability to move the ball on third down has been exceptional this year, Ryan, because they are so good on first and second down. They are
Mhm.
excellent on the first 2 downs. Now, they haven't gotten into a ton of third downs like like a team that's not good, but they've actually gotten into more third downs than you'd think an offense this explosive would be. They're at 13 a game right now, Ryan. That's actually a decent number of third downs in a game, right? And so, but they're converting them because they're
Yep.
getting into so many good third down situations, but they've also converted some longer third downs too, Ryan. And so this
Mhm.
is a really dangerous team in this regard. And it's one where, if you're Notre Dame, if you're dominating in the trenches, it's going to lead to first and second down success, which means run stops, 0 to 2 yards, minuses, which are obviously negative plays, and forced incompletions. Those are the disruptions that I talk about. If you can hold a team to 2 or minus yards every time they run the football, that's a win. That's a win for the defense, right? If you can create a 0 or a negative in the pass game, incompletion or sack, those are things that lead them to more 3rd and 8s and 3rd and 9s and plays like that. And that's where Notre Dame is going to have more success with those stops. And that's really what led to a lot of their success early in 2020 is after the jump that North Carolina got out to, Notre Dame started really having early down success, creating more incompletions, creating negatives or zeros in the run game. And then that put North Carolina behind the chains. And once the Notre Dame pass rush could kind of pin its ears back and get after Sam Howell, they had more success. Now, last year, they had similar success against Sam Howell in those situations, but they missed on their sack attempts, and that allowed Sam Howell to scramble. You can't allow that because this North Carolina team to me is too good, Ryan, to turn a 3rd and 10 into a first down or a 4th and 8 into a first down because of a scramble. Can't allow those things to happen. But if you can control the trenches, that puts them in more third down and longs. That's going to lead to more stops. That's how you win this football game. It's simple to say. It's much harder to do when you're playing an offense that's this well coached and has the kind. Again, we said yesterday, this isn't an elite talent team on North Carolina. Their talent isn't such where you look and say, yep, that's 50 points a game and 547 yards per game. Yep, absolutely. Especially since they haven't had Josh Downs the last 2 games. It's good talent with great scheme. And the best way to beat a team like that is to dominate the talent. And that has to begin because the way that you can dominate the talent that then impacts the scheme is to dominate in the trenches. And that's ultimately, as we've said throughout this breakdown, is going to be the key in this game. The front 4 has to play this week like they did last week, but finish better. They do that, then I think that's how Notre Dame wins.
Well, this isn't a unique thing to just North Carolina. Most offenses are like this, Brian. Well, actually, all offenses want to be like this. They want to play ahead of the chains, right? Like they don't want to be bad on first down to set yourself up in bad second or third down situations. Like you want to play in those advantageous situations. I think it's even more important for North Carolina because I think it really sets up the play action game. It sets up the RPO game, their ability to win early on those downs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think
Their
that's going to be screen game, like all of that stuff, right? The movement-based stuff where you're trying to manipulate the second and third levels, like that stuff is designed off of having early success on those first down type of situations. So they want to do that. And they want to do that consistently. And I already mentioned it when I talked a little bit about Drake May. When this offense is humming, it seems very methodical, right? It's just like everything is just kind of moving quick. Everything is getting the ball out quick. Everything is just kind of happening at a very good pace. You interrupt that pace is the best way. Like you need to make those runs on first down for 0 gains. You need to get some negative plays. You need to get early down sacks. Like those things are going to be huge, huge parts of this football game, in my opinion. You want to put a guy like Drake May, like you don't want it to be a 3rd and 3, a 3rd and 4, where like he can just kind of sit back there and make a really quick decision. You want it to be 3rd and 8 plus. You want him to sit back there and have to hold the football a little longer in the pocket. That's when you're going to have your most success. So waiting on early downs is crucial. And these numbers even lead me to my early points of like, hey, you want to be aggressive with this football team? Because Brian, right now, if you're a bend but don't break team and you let them get in the red zone, they're showing you right now that they can finish with touchdowns.
And that's been an issue. That's been an issue in the past for Paul Longo's offenses. But their better teams have that's not been the issue. So this year so far, they've been very good at touchdown percentage. They, as the numbers show, obviously this year they rank. I'm sorry, I just looked at opponent red zone percentage. This year, as you see the numbers, this year they're obviously a top 10 unit when it comes to red zone touchdowns. But that was kind of one of the issues they had last year. Last year they ranked 83rd which is why their points were down. When you look at their points relative to their yards per game, they were down a lot from where you'd think they would be total offense wise, right? So if you look at their total offense last year, they were 468.6, 6.8 yards per play. The year before, they were they were higher, but they were 537 and 7.6, which is better, but not better to the point where you see the kind of drop off they had last year from a scoring standpoint. They were down at 35 points per game. 35 points per game. And they had some really rough offensive games last year. And part of the, 21 points against South Carolina in a bowl game, 10 points against Virginia Tech in the opener, 22 against Georgia Tech later in the season. And the reason they had that success is because they had trouble on third down and they had trouble turning possessions into touchdowns. And that's a big difference. And, if you go look at the red zone numbers and you just put the touchdowns you have the same touchdown conversion rate in 2021 that they had in 2020, you'd actually would have scored about the same, if not more points than they did the year before. And so that's obviously, like I said, that's a big part of this as well. And then all of a sudden you help your defense because you're getting 7s instead of 3s. So yes, to your point, Ryan, you have to not let them get in the red zone a ton. And Notre Dame has not been a great red zone team this year. I mean, because to your point, you pointed to this number right here, Ryan. Well, this number hasn't been good either. And they haven't been making stops. And so that's going to be a big part of this game. So that's it for this part of the breakdown, folks. We are not going to have a traditional mailbag. I actually have to finish packing and hit the road. I'm heading down to the Mid-Atlantic region, or I'm heading down to Virginia today, and then I'll be in North Carolina here very soon. But we did have a super chat from Antoine Johnson. He said, so when is Irish Breakdown going to release their Do Your Effing Job t-shirts? I bet they sell good. It's a good life and team model. I need money for this idea. We won't be doing that. I think there's other people that are doing that. That actually is kind of funny and not a bad idea. But yeah, that's we're going to stick with the IB stuff. But I do love that. And we've talked a little bit about this. I have no problem with what Tommy Setter did. I don't. And anyone that's like, I don't know, I just have no problem with it, right? Because there was coaching involved. Whatever, it is what it is. But
I did like Tommy's. I like Tommy's response to it too in the press conference that he was at too. Brian, he just kind of said he had to say the one part of I regret my language, even though he probably actually does.
He doesn't.
But you have
and
to
he
say
shouldn't.
that out loud.
I mean, whatever.
He shouldn't.
Right.
Well, no, I'm not arguing that at all. It's just that he's saying I regret my language, but I don't regret what I did. Right? Like that's the tough coaching that I know Drew can handle, and that's what he should say, in my opinion.
And honestly, if Drew Pine is going to fold because he got cussed at in the middle of a game, then he's not a guy that you're going to win with. But you and I both know that's not something that's going to drag Drew Pine down. It's not.
No.
He's a tough kid. His older brother was a linebacker, right? Don't let the private school Connecticut thing fool you. Don't let the 6'1" 190 fool you. Drew's a tough kid. And he comes from a tough family. You know what I mean? Like football tough. I mean, his dad played football. His grandfather played football. His brother played at Brown. His brother played at IMG, right? I mean, so this is a football family. And Drew's a tough kid, and he's going to be fine from that regard. I mean, he's got to play better, but he's not going to shrink because of, getting yelled at or whatever. He's got to play better. Simple as that. But yeah, I'm glad that he said what he said. I mean, that's fine. You have to somewhat do the mea culpa because NBC had it on. I mean, that ticked me off, man. Like if I'm Tommy Rees next game, I'm just going to have a big giant water bottle. Actually, probably like 3 giant water bottles just sitting like right there. Like my wife buys these water bottles from Costco. They're like this tall. I'd have like 4 of those just
so
lined up between
them.
me and the camera. Yep. Absolutely.
He's going to make a barrier of water bottles. I love
seriously.
I love
it. Seriously. But anyway, that's my 2 cents on that. So that's going to do it for today's show. We will have another show tonight, obviously 6:00. It'll be the IB Nation Sports Talk team. Sean Stiers will be hosting that. Ryan and I will be back tomorrow for our keys to victory. Some of them we talked today, but we're going to go really into specifics of what Notre Dame can do on first and second down to win this game. What specifically they can do in the run game and pass game. What specifically they can do to slow down Carolina. We've talked general control the line of scrimmage. We'll get into some more specifics tomorrow, some more situational discussion tomorrow. And then, of course, Friday, it is prediction time. And then we will not only make predictions and preview the Notre Dame game, but we are also going to have some fun with some other games, right? And we have decided on those games, and I'm going to let people know what those are now. I'm just trying to pull up the picks. We're going to talk about the Clemson-Wake Forest game. We're going to talk Tennessee, Florida, Arkansas A&M, and Ohio State and Wisconsin. And we're also going to pick our upset pick. And I'm gonna ask you a question here, Ryan, before we get out of here. Yep. What else does Kansas have to do to stop being huge underdogs in like every game? Like they were 10.5 point underdogs to Northwestern. Duke, I'm talking about. Why is Duke? Yeah. Duke is what I meant to say. They were 10.5 point underdog to Northwestern and slapped them. They're now a 6.5 point underdog to Kansas. Now, look, Kansas is having a really nice year, but so's Duke. So that one surprised me a little bit, to be honest with you. But yeah, there must be no respect in the betting world for Duke right now, even though they're 3-0, and they've had some pretty convincing victories so far, Ryan, which is a little surprising, to be honest with you. Mike Elko, one of my favorite dudes, is off to quite a start. They're outscoring their first two opponents 36.7 to 14.3. That's not bad. That's not bad at all. No. It's not bad at all. So that was your upset pick this week too.
That was my upset
which is why
pick,
I'm setting you up for that, because I like what Kansas is doing, but man, Duke is getting Duke's not getting the same level of respect that Kansas is getting right now.
Duke's getting good quarterback play too, Brian. And I think that there was one misnomer with that team that Mike Elko took over, is the fact that Duke has some decent defensive talent, like Shaka Hayward and Dwayne Carter at defensive tackle. Like there are some guys there, man. So I like what Elko's done early on in this tenure here, and I think they are going to go on road in Kansas and pull that upset, which is why it was my upset pick for a little tease.
Yeah. Dwayne Carter is a kid that Notre Dame recruited for a little bit coming out of high school. He's a Cincinnati kid, so he's a good football player. Yeah, he's a good football player. Yeah. So yeah, they I don't know if they offered him. They might have offered him, but he didn't have a committable offer. But they definitely looked at him. So he's a good football player, and they've had some surprisingly. I remember Kobe Kwanzaa. Right, a couple years ago, they had really good, like around 18 to 20. No, it was about 16 to 19. They had really good secondary talent. A couple years ago, they had two really good defensive ends. When Notre Dame played them in, was it 2019?
Chris Rumpf and number Victor, 51.
Victor.
DMcKay.
Yes. Yes, that's who I'm thinking of. Is that kid right there? And then they had was it last year? They had a kid, Dimukiji is who we're thinking of. And then they had the Derek Tangelo kid who transferred to Penn State. That Drew Jordan a couple years ago. They've thrown out some pretty good defensive talent for their level. Their issue has been offense. They have not been good on it, which is surprising when you consider who their head coach has been the last few years.
I know.
They just were never the same on offense after Daniel Jones left. So anyway, that's going to do it for today's show. We'll be back tomorrow to discuss all of that kind of stuff and even more. And we'll have some great breakdowns. 10 o'clock a.m. on Saturday, 10 o'clock Eastern in the morning. Obviously, we'll have Sean Stiers and Vince will have the IB countdown to kickoff. And then, of course, game's going to be at 3:30. And me, Ryan, Sean, and Vince will be there for the post-game show. So tons and tons of content. And, of course, hit that like button, everybody. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the notification bell. Share the podcast. Sign up for the message boards, boards.irishbreakdown.com. A lot of good discussion going on there. And, of course, make sure you sign up for our CFB Nation podcasts on Apple, Spotify, also on YouTube. The guys dropped a show today. They talked about Herm Edwards being fired. They talked about other coaches on the hot seat. Did their week 3 predictions. Notre Dame. Is Notre Dame going to make a bowl game or not? They did some early season bowl projections. A lot of good stuff. Episode 1 of what they did this week was today. Tomorrow, they have a preview coming out of the week 4 games. And Ryan, it is going to be another really good week of football. Usually like the week 2 or week 3, there's that 1 week where it's like everybody plays a bunch of garbage. There's like no good games. Now 4 weeks in a row, there's been good game, like multiple really good games every week, which has made this so far a really fun college football season. If you can distance yourself from the feeling of being 1 and 2, there's been some really good football games so far this year, and some surprising outcomes as well. So we'll have our picks. I'm going to try to hang on to first place. I've got some picks that are going to be a little different than everybody else's this week, so I may distance myself or fall back with some of the picks I had. Luckily, last week the only stupid pick I made was Auburn beating Penn State. That was dumb. So I'm not necessarily a believer in Penn State yet, but Auburn's garbage. Speaking of that, that's one of the coaches they talked about being on the hot seat in the CFB Nation, the CFB All America podcast with Bill Choate.
As he should be.
As he should be. There's no doubt about it. So check that out as well, everybody. So for Ryan, I'm Brian. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining us on the Irish Breakdown podcast.